The Prime Minister certainly was in a reflective mood, having a long discursive discussion with Joe Biden that seemed to cover everything from the current state of global affairs to how things in the world have changed over time, through to some very specific detailed negotiations on things like how to deal with climate change and critical minerals supply chain. So they covered a lot of ground in those 90 minutes, but it certainly had the flavour of something of a valedictory discussion. Anthony Albanese was pointing out that he is the first foreign leader that's been invited into the private residence of Joe Biden. That hasn't happened before in his many years in senior political positions in his time as a senior US political figure. So having been invited into the home, given a tour around the property, this is clearly a very different from the normal state leaders meeting that we would expect to see. And Antony Albanese clearly went into that meeting with that mindset, saying he was very keen to always learn from the wisdom that Joe Biden has accumulated over decades in public office.
Well, it was an opportunity for me to express my support and congratulations for the role that President Biden has played. He has been a good friend of Australia, but he's also been an advocate for the rule of law. The other thing about President Biden as well is he's someone who is optimistic and someone who speaks about hope. Hope's always better than fear.
Yes, and Joe Biden, now the proud owner of a Royal Australian Air Force flying jacket of some sort, which was the Prime Minister's gift to the President. I guess that caps off what was a fairly warm meeting, as you point out there, Melissa Clark. Let's cast forward to tomorrow, though. The Quad leaders meeting will bring together Joe Biden, Anthony Albanese and the leaders of India and Japan. What do we know about the agenda there, or at least as it's been outlined by the Prime Minister today?
What we know is that the leaders will be very much focused on regional security. That does mean China to a large degree. It also means North Korea. They have a great deal of concern about China's actions in the South China Sea. They are worried about the actions of the North Korean regime. They also want to ensure that there is stability as we have a changing geopolitical power across the whole Indo-Pacific region, and that's multifaceted, and that's the reason for bringing together the leaders of Australia and the US, Japan and India to ensure that they can work together where there is commonality. Now, we're expecting that there'll be a particular focus on maritime issues in this particular meeting tomorrow that will happen tomorrow local time here. That will be at the school that Joe Biden went to. So again, another personal touch and another element of personal flavour to this visit as Joe Biden's in his final days. But back to the discussion agenda, we're expecting that there'll be announcements around cooperation with Coast Guard from different countries in the Pacific and Indian Ocean. So that's a new development. They'll also be announcing some additional funding to help with health issues, in particular cancer prevention, which I think goes to explaining the broader remit that the Quad is taking on. It is not confining itself to discussions about security, but health and economic issues are important too. And it really has grown in importance in the last couple of years as a forum for dialogue between these very prominent countries in the region. And certainly there's some concern that once Joe Biden is gone, not knowing who might replace him at the White House, if it's Kamala Harris, perhaps her commitment to the Quad will remain the same as she's been Vice President in this period. But a big question mark over whether or not the Republican nominee, Donald Trump, would have the same commitment to the Quad if he were to enter into the White House after the November presidential election. And that's certainly been on the minds of officials. But Anthony Albanese today was really pointed to say that he thinks that the amount of support that the Quad has been able to engender throughout Congress and throughout senior officials in Washington means he's pretty confident that the Quad will remain an important feature of our nation's relationships regardless of what happens in the November election.
I know from my own experience, one-on-one discussions I've had across the Congress and across the Senate, how deep the support for AUKUS is, and there's no question in my mind that AUKUS will continue to have the support of any future US administration.
All right, and Melissa Clark, it probably says something about the importance Joe Biden and his administration place on the relationship with Australia that they even found time for these talks in the midst of the latest deterioration in security conditions in the Middle East. Not only was Joe Biden there, so was his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. It came up in the discussions with Anthony Albanese. What did we learn from that?
Yeah, it's certainly notable that this was part of their discussions and that Australia has still managed to secure this sort of time with the President at a time of incredible instability in the Middle East, where the US has been very dedicated in efforts to try and ensure a ceasefire, but have not come to any fruition yet. Now, Anthony Albanese has told us that they did discuss the latest events in the Middle East in their meeting today. He was very clear that Australia and the US are both keen to see a ceasefire, that they are concerned about the prospect of escalation. Anthony Albanese didn't want to go into too much detail, which is perhaps not surprising given how quickly things are developing and the sensitive nature around some of the details. But he was very clear to say that the Australian government has great concerns, not just about what has already happened between the events of October 7 and subsequent responses from Israel since, the ongoing case of the hostages, but also his concerns about the potential for things to deteriorate in Lebanon. And he reiterated the Australian government's call for any Australian citizens who are in Lebanon to return home now while they can, while the commercial flights are still available, that there is great concern that things will continue to deteriorate further, and that might make the ability of Australians to get home all that much harder, and to take the chance now while they can. So that's been a consistent message from the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, for quite some time, and the latest events we've seen in the last 24 hours have really compelled the Australian government to make that case again to Australians who are currently in Lebanon.